So welcome to this latest As We Hear It podcast. This is our opportunity to speak with some of the leading developers and owners of property across London and the UK. And this week I'm delighted that we're welcoming James Goldsmith, who runs the leasing team and function at AXA, and most notably at the moment is responsible for delivering the fully occupied, ultimately, 22 Bishopsgate and all that involves. So welcome, James.
About 2/3 at the moment, Chris, not fully occupied, but anyway.
Excellent. So James, welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is, for me personally, really interesting because I've got some quite big questions for you in relation to the building, but also just, I guess, what's happened over the course of the last 15 months, sorry, 15 years.
Sure.
God, let's hope it's not 15 years. You can't help but think the one thing you'd be challenged to deliver coming out of this pandemic is one of the largest towers in the UK. And, you know, we hear from clients concerns about being in tall buildings and all the rest of it. Sorry to get right into the heart of it.
Yeah, you have a little bit, haven't you?
But I really wanted to just cover that because I think it's something that most people that we speak to are really interested in. Not that they necessarily would never go into a tower, but just from a landlord point of view, what sort of things you're thinking about, how you make that transition back into the office and back into a tower building as smooth and as comfortable as it could possibly be.
Wow. That's quite a big question, Chris. You said 15 years mistakenly rather than 15 months. Actually, I do think we can go back, 12 years to the global financial crisis. And I mention that because, you know, as businesses came out of the global financial crisis, I think boardrooms around the country suddenly realized how much they had invested in their offices. Long leases that they couldn't get rid of, sometimes surplus office space, redundant office space. And what did they do with it? And actually what a burden that was on a company trying to come out of, as I said, the global financial crisis. And that put real estate straight into the boardroom. Real estate directors became far more influential in shaping how occupiers use their property in terms of brand, in terms of something that was adaptable over time, over different business cycles, you know, what it looked like and how it could attract talent. And I struggle with that talent word a little bit because it's like using an adjective to describe a verb, but when I say talent, we all know what I mean. So, you know, I think the seeds of everything that we've learned over the last kind of couple of years, that's sort of me, where it came from. So, you know, what we've seen is just the development of everything that was going on. I think what you were referring to when you talked about tower, and it'd be great to get your perspective on it as well, because, you know, you've had a couple of occupiers that have come and had a look. Is probably one of scale and perception. And I read this really good article when we were starting out with this project, and that we bought back in 2015 and really hit the button to accelerate and see through construction after the Brexit vote in 2016. So this was a big call for us to develop, you know, 1.25 million square foot speculatively, you know, starting in earnest in the autumn of 2016. And I read a really good article by Tim Leckie, and he was talking about Ronald Coase. I hadn't heard of Ronald Coase. Ronald Coase was an economist in the mid 20th century, I think I'm fair to say. And Coase's law was how corporates would grow and grow because it was a way of capturing IP. It was a way of creating efficiencies. If you internalized all your functions and had them inward looking, it was a more efficient organization and it was a more kind of cost-effective organization. But you can imagine the sort of environment that those organizations persisted in, which were like big silo buildings. And, you know, we wanted to create something that was the counter of that, because there was something else going on about businesses actually wanted to get smaller, more agile, and having to, you know, get to market quicker and collaborating. Kind of an overused term, but, you know, we know what it means. And then last year I was reading Matthew Syed's book. I'm a big fan of Matthew Syed, who you and I might remember as a tennis player, but obviously, well, I do, you might not. But, you know, now writes for the Times. He's a business consultant, writes some really good books. And the one I was reading is this book called Rebel Ideas, The Power of Diverse Thinking. There was this brilliant section where he was talking about Route 128 in Boston, Massachusetts. Back in the 70s and 80s, that was like the original tech corridor before Silicon Valley had come on. He talked about how these big organizations occupied big buildings surrounded in fencing. If you worked for them, you had to sign NDAs. If you went to dinner parties, you couldn't tell each other who you worked for. So there were these big siloed organizations doing great things. And yet on the other side of the US, on the West Coast, there were kids in t-shirts and jeans bouncing in and out of each other's garages, cafes, different businesses, but collaborating and working together and actually becoming more creative because of it. And for me, that's just a lovely analogy about how scale used in the wrong way can be a bad thing, but scale used in the right way, being part of an ecosystem, a community, and sharing ideas is a really good thing. And I guess that's the essence of what we always want to try and get across in 22. It's a building that was always about people and talent and how businesses could attract them, because that was 6 years ago, and it is now the biggest issues facing corporates. How could you create an environment that would help those businesses attract the people they want to attract? And I can't remember whether it's you or someone else was saying it. You mentioned you did an earlier one with Gerard. Obviously, is a brilliant developer, and he was talking about offices needing to be more like hotels, and yeah, they do in terms of the service culture and everything else. Equally, I like to look at 22 as being more like a university, because if you are trying to attract talent, what's the environment that bright, smart people want to go into? And in a world where perhaps office is less about process, because AI is going to do process, or we can do process in different environments. You don't have to be in an office environment. What is the purpose of the office? It's about creating social infrastructures. It's about trust. It's about sharing ideas, solving problems. And if you think back over your career, over your life, Chris, where did you do that? University was an incredibly fertile place. And therefore, if we can make offices feel more like a university, then that's got to be a good thing going forwards.
And that, to be fair, you've been totally consistent with that view, because that's always been your view since you began the project. And I remember talking to you in the very, very early days, and that was always your aspiration, that this ecosystem, it would kind of become self-fulfilling. It
is, isn't it, Chris? It's sorry, I didn't let you finish that, but it's how do you overcome, I guess the challenge for us at the outset of this was, how do you overcome people's perceptions of scale? When you're a spec building, 1.25 million square foot, the first occupiers coming in and looking and thinking, well, this is quite big. Where do I fit in this? What is the rest of it going to look like? That first mover thing was always going to be the challenge. So we had to overcome scale. We never talk about the height of the building, which is about 280 meters, by the way, a bit shorter than Shard. We don't talk about the overall size and scale and everything else. We try to talk about it, much more human terms. So rather than saying 1.25 million square foot, we say 10,000 people or whatever it is. And people can relate to those sort of things. So it's not just this sort of like glass and steel tower building. It's how do you make it human? And we can come on to that in terms of how we've activated the ground floor and the management of the building, most critically, and the amenities you put into it.
I guess the challenge must be, though, that it's a Bishopsgate address. It's an extraordinarily tall tower. To the uninitiated, it's just another glass and steel structure. Getting across that vision and what you're trying to create, and why it's not just another tower, it's actually something quite special. It's incredibly tough, isn't it?
Well, I guess there's incredibly tough. Yeah, look, it was a challenge. It's interesting because actually, I remember in a previous conversation you were asking about the Shard, where I worked before this, and if you look at the parallels, these are both towers, glass and steel. They both had or have floor plates, which to some people would challenge convention, but we think that is a good thing to offer points of difference and variety and everything else. And they both provide an amenity. equally they're sort of quite different, because the Shard is what I would say a mixed use building. Offices were only about half of the whole thing, whereas 22 Bishopsgate is an office building with amenity, but that's what it is. I guess the Shard was pioneering a new location. We're trying to get people to think about the location in a slightly different way. So there's that. And yet the other thing is, people will talk about, and rightly will call the Shard an icon. And I would wholeheartedly agree that the Shard is an icon. Now, we always have this kind of, I wouldn't say argument, but discussion with our marketing and PR team about whether or not we should be calling 22 Bishopsgate an icon. I don't think we do. You know, icon isn't something that we call it. An icon takes time. You earn a badge like that. You don't call it yourself, other people will. So if our occupiers want to term it that, fine. If the architectural press wants to call it that, fine. More importantly, if society, if London wants to call it an icon, fine. But that takes a long time to earn, and that is absolutely not something for us to say. And actually, I thought it was interesting. Last night, I was just, actually it might have been probably watching football, I can't remember, on Sunday night. But in the last week, I've seen 3 different adverts now feature 22 in the background. And it's those sort of little things that just start changing people's perception of what it is. And actually, Chris, having talked, I can't remember what your question was. What was it?
I was just saying it's difficult to get away from the fact it's just a jolly big tower in the middle of the city.
Well,
because let's face it, you delivered it, James, right at the point where there was no one around, because most people were at home
in terms of hitting practical completion.
Yeah, so people didn't maybe get that same impact of the hoardings coming down and being able to see that extraordinary ground floor and first floor arrangement and the permeability of the building.
It was always about how we designed it and how we messaged it, and and actually, Harry Badham was, obviously on this a long time before I was, and he sort of brought me, very gratefully into the project. Karen Cook from PLP, the architect, has been brilliant and actually worked on the first manifestation on this, and of course working with Stuart Lipton at LRD as our development partner, and Despina. And they all went over to Australia, and they did a tour there. And that's where the birth of this whole kind of people idea came together, and how the Australians were using their buildings and how they were humanizing that ground floor. So all these values sort of came into the design right at the outset. It's not something, you don't just design a building and think, right, how are we going to make this work? You have to get the idea and the concept right, and the design follows, which is what happened. Then it's how we talk about it, how we brand it. But for me, it's also critically, Chris, about how we manage it. And sorry, going off subject a little bit, for us, how do we create value in this building? Traditionally, value would be dependent upon how you get the highest rent for the largest amounts of space on the longest leases. For us, that's creating value by lease, by a contract. And, that creates a value in a point of time. It creates short-term value. But, we and our investors are looking at sustainable income stream value over 10, 15, 20 years. So we've got a much longer-term horizon. And, for us, the value in the building isn't just the glass and steel, but actually it's that whole management ethic. And I don't think you've been in since we've opened up.
No.
Slowly. We've opened up. We are doing viewings now. But we've got the whole management team, the lobby team in there. We're sort of almost in beta mode. So over half the building, about half the building now is fitted out, ready for occupiers to go in. But I think everyone's waiting for lockdown, or the end of lockdown, which apparently is now going to be in a couple of weeks' time. But I think we're reckoning September is when people are really going to start coming back. So that's when it will really kind of come to life. But that whole ground floor plane, we wanted to make that really open, human. We almost wanted to bring the street into the building. We've got art in there. There's colour. The way the lobby team are dressed, it's almost like going into, if I can say it, into an Apple store. That's the sort of experience that we want to create. We don't have corporate branding everywhere. That was a big decision of ours, by the way. The first occupier we were doing a deal with was for about 50,000 square foot. And they said, right, no one can have signage bigger than ours. And we thought, yikes, supposing a bank comes along for like 250,000 square foot and says, and everything else, we've just shot ourselves in the foot and we can't do it. But we thought, do you know what? We have to stay with the value and integrity of the building, which is the ground floor. It's human, it's democratic, it's equal. So you'll see the signage downstairs is really, it's not even in there at the moment, but what we're putting in is going to be pretty minimal. We don't want it to feel like this. I think there's one occupier's advisor called it, they said, we don't want it to look like NASCAR. You know, they don't want it like big brands all over the place. And that's what we've tried to create. And in fact, in the evenings, it will be opened up to the public because the restaurant and the food floor, second level, is entirely open to the public after 6 o'clock in the evening, because we want to humanize that space and have something that works like 24 hours a day. And actually all the occupiers have really bought into that. So whilst if you stand back and from a distance, you see a glass and tower building, when you go into it, Chris, you get a really different feel. And the other way that we wanted to, we do that is actually by putting the amenity into the building. And, you know, there are lots of reasons why we do that. So about 10% of the building is put across to what we call shared spaces that everybody can use. And, you know, that created management challenges, and we can come on to that. It's a very easy thing to talk about, but to actually make it work and make it work over the long term, you know, we've had to be quite creative in terms of how we've done that. But if you think about having all these sort of like different office floors, how do you mix them up? How, you know, when you're working for one of the people in the building, how do you meet other people in the building and create that like social network? And you and I work for Deloitte, you know, brilliant company, but when you go down to the Deloitte restaurant, actually that's when you meet other people from Deloitte, but it's only people from Deloitte. But, you know, it's a great place for sort of mixing people. So we feel all these amenity spaces, apart from creating, you know, environments, which means occupiers don't have to put into their own space, it is a way of sort of mixing everyone up in a building. So my analogy, my metaphor, is almost you've got all these different layers of offices. How do you mix them all up and create this kind of like wonderful cocktail? What's the cocktail stick that mixes them all up? And by the way, that's an analogy I borrowed from Juliet Morgan when we were talking about Shard many years ago. But it's those amenity spaces which kind of, you know, are the mixing pot to bring it all together. And that's what every occupier coming into the building has bought into, being part of something bigger.
Which all sounds fantastic and very exciting and relatively unique for a building like this in that location. But I guess it still comes back to the same point of how do you get that message out there and make people who are, you know, traditionally West End occupiers, even out of town occupiers, realise that a building in the city could give them what they thought they could only achieve in, let's say, a slightly more cool or vibrant location, either inside or outside London.
Yeah, there's various reasons why it might be because there isn't a supply of that kind of space in the West End. We could turn around and say, "Hey, come here because we're cheaper." No one's going to do that move because it's cheaper. It has to offer something different, Chris. Just to pick back, you know, for me, success. Look, you know, we're investment managers. We've got, you know, people invest in this building. We have to achieve the best terms. This is, you know, I've said it elsewhere before. We're not doing this as a social experiment. This was a huge thing. You know, not just the money that we've invested in it, but reputation. We have to get this right. We always knew that the core of our first occupiers would probably be more traditional city occupiers. But over time, we would see diversity. And for me, success isn't just about the rent and how quickly we achieve it and lease length. And I said, you know, pretty relaxed about lease length. For me, you know, at the end of this building, you know, have we done a good job on leasing? That will come down to the diversity of occupiers. Yeah. And actually that coming together really nicely. Most at the moment from the city, but we've got one or two others that we can't mention for various reasons. That's, you know, is brilliant to that whole brand endorsement. And we are seeing more of it, Chris, you know, for an absolute fact. I think people have gone away from the office for a year. They've learned how not to just press the print button. They've learned to drink water out of the tap. They don't just get it out of things in plastic cups or plastic bottles. We've learned a lot of good habits. People have got out of the habit of commuting. And so actually, if you look at where we are in terms of city location, the transport infrastructure, but also the emerging social infrastructure, and places, great places are founded on three principles: culture, and innovation, and governance. And if there's something that the city has got in abundance, it's culture, it's an innovation culture, and business infrastructure, and governance. And I think people are seeing that, and it really feels like it's getting into a different place. And that whole thing about accessibility, not everyone lives down Chiswick and Clapham anymore. They're all around North East London, East London, South London. That's another reason why people want to come to the city. And I don't want that to sound like an advert. When we pressed the button on this back in 2016, that we saw that eastwards migration, and the fact that it was in the city, we saw that as a really solid investment opportunity, and something that was only going to get.
So I guess you could conclude, couldn't you, that actually where I started this conversation about no one wants to be in a tower anymore. Actually, if you step away from the fact that it's a tower, and you talk about a lot more about the overall mission for the building, which is not about a mission of being a 1.25 million square foot monolith. It's actually about being a community, an ecosystem, a city in its own right, or a series of villages, depending how you want to use those analogies. Actually, people choose to go to the building because of what it offers, not because it's necessarily a well-run building or because it's in a great location, but actually because there's a spirit and a genuine desire within to create something that isn't like the building next door. And leading on from that, I wonder, as we look at the whole change that is inevitably going to come out of this in people's working practices, both at a corporate but also individual level. Actually, maybe this social experiment that you haven't done at 22 actually becomes a template for many other buildings in different ways where they're struggling to find their point of difference or to create that opportunity around purpose rather than process that you talked about.
That's not for us to say. We have we have our project, we have our investors, and we've gone about this in a certain way. And the answer to your question will be in the success of this building in 2, 5, 10 years' time. What I do know is there is quite a few people's websites that are coming out now, and you kind of like strike out 22, and you think that sounds a lot like 22. But let's see. They're not necessarily following us. I think perhaps we're all finding this mission together. And as I say, it's a very easy thing to talk about, but it's a much harder thing to actually put in practice. You put in, over 100,000 square foot amenities, or occupiers are saying, well, hang on, how are you going to control the pricing? How long will it be there? How will it change over the time? And, getting these things right is quite a challenge. So we don't lease all that space. That was our original business. Now, nearly all of them will be management agreements, because of our operators' finances post-COVID and how they invest in the building. But more particularly, and what we wanted was to ensure that we had a degree of control over those spaces, because it's not about creating money from the amenity, it's about creating value in the 1.25 million square foot offices. And that's why we put the amenity in, and that's why we have to choose our operators really carefully. So this is a thing to talk about, harder thing to put into practice. And that's something else, that there will be people who say glass and steel tower in the city, that's not our brand. McKinsey saying actually we want to go to something funky in Tottenham Court Road, and how you seem to do something differently. And look, the house you're sitting in, the house or the bungalow I'm about to refurbish, and Chris, we just have different personal looks. Actually, outside your house, but and it's the same with people's offices. And what's the perception of it? But we just try and present it as it is to show ourselves how human we are, I mean, just as a little thing, we had to relocate the marketing suite because it was on a particular level, which has now been fitted out for something else. And of course, the perceived wisdom was, do you know what, James, put your marketing suite right at the top of the building, bang, so you've got this fantastic view over the whole of central London. That would be obvious, wouldn't it? Actually, we've put it into level 1, right next door to our management suite, where we have Danny Lemon, who used to be general manager of the Shard, and he joined us a couple of years ago now, probably the biggest decision we made a couple of years ago. Got a fantastic team. They're the people that create the environment, the experience in the building. We wanted our market suite right next to them because that's where you create the value. And just getting across this kind of humanity, because when people are signing up for their lease, whether it's 5, 10, 15 years, interestingly, our weighted average lease at the moment, and we're just about 2/3 either leased or exclusive, is over 10 years. Because actually people, if people are investing in it, they kind of want the certainty, and they think, you know what, if we're going to invest in it, we may as well take the incentives that, go with that as well. So, we give the flexibility, but a lot of people actually want that longer term certainty.
Interesting. Well, look, fascinating, James. If I could just ask you, as I do on these, to give us your 3 predictions for the real estate market, and it doesn't necessarily need to be related to 22. It could just be general thoughts, but it's just useful and interesting to have people's perspectives as we kind of wind up the discussion.
You could have given me some warning on that, couldn't you? What are my 3 soapbox things? I think we need to be less defensive about real estate. The fact is, we went through COVID, in the first 3 months, we suddenly saw offices are going to get reinvented. We're going to need more space. We're going to we're going to have perspex twin everywhere. We're going to have yellow and black tape everywhere, and everyone's going to have 2-meter sticks, and you can't get in the lift together. For me, that was just a really short-term reaction. I don't take this lightly, COVID, by the way, and we're going to learn a lot of good lessons from it. But actually, what we're seeing is occupiers trying to use less space, but use it more productively. And that's fine. We should just say, we need more. Actually, less space being used more productively, more intensively, I think is a good thing for the environment. And I think it creates a better office environment to work in. So we're very happy to let people use less space. And look, this is a massive generalization, but putting aside people in growth mode or anything else, generally we're reckoning people are targeting 10 to 25% less space for the same amount of people, but using it more intensively. So basically having less assigned desks, but more kind of collaborative community site spaces. So I think that's the thing. ESG, we've just seen go through the roof, Chris. A lot of chief executives have gone to Davos, or the equivalent of Davos in the digital environment, and they're all making massive pronouncements on the environment. And it's no longer a certificate and a nice to have. It's very real.
Yeah, it's the first or second, isn't it? Priority.
It is, and it's not just the green thing. It's not just the environment, Chris. It's also inclusivity and diversity, equal opportunity, and that's massive. And for us, this is we have these 4 values in our building through which we manage. And learning and education is one that we're really keen to promote, giving everyone equal opportunity, and shared ideas create better ideas and more rapid progress. And I guess, Chris, that takes me on to the kind of the third point, which is just much greater diversity of people in our industry. Sometimes it's people who are outside our industry that come up with the best ideas and challenge hardest. A lot of us went and did the same courses at university. We learned the same principles about how to invest and how to develop real estate. And it's difficult because when we invest in or develop real estate, we're investing developing for 25 to 100 years. 22 Bishopsgate is not going to come down in over 100 years. So it's a massive investment when you get it right. And sometimes it's very easy to say what went before, and we value things and we look at things by what went before, what are they doing, rather than saying, do you know what, that's the past, what's the future? And that's quite a big mindset. And sometimes you just need people from more diverse environments. Going back to the very first point we were making about this building, about creating an environment of diversity, inclusivity, and you're more productive and agile. I think our industry needs to be a lot more diverse. And look, everyone's getting that, certainly in terms of how we employ, I'm sure, in terms of how you're looking at it. Universities, everyone, they're getting this, that we have to have a wider profile of
do things differently.
Our industry.
We're more reflective
for sure.
of the society we're in, it's ultimately, isn't it?
Absolutely right.
Yeah, fascinating. As I knew it would be, James. It could never be anything else with you.
Well, we had our flat whites to go with it, haven't we? Which is a shame. But anyway, no, I hope you can turn that into something, Chris. But always appreciate your perspective as well. We have to listen to the. We're an industry that is tended to work on behalf of what the investors wanted to do. And you can't take that away. That's always the thing. But we have to look more at what the consumers are about as well. Adapt more to them.
Perfect. All right. Well, look, thank you, James. Appreciate it, and thank you to those who are watching this podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.